And so we're moving right along here in The Masks of God, Volume 1, Primitive Mythology. We're up to Chapter 4 now. Chapter 4 is entitled The Province of the Immolated Kings. And immolated simply means that they are sacrificed. So these are kings. Here he's going to go into the myth of ritual regicide, what Fraser outlined in The Golden Vow. Its prevalence, its spread, the structure of the archetype, where he thinks it originated, and what it has to do with the myths of the planters. But he begins by recounting a tale that was told to the German ethnographer Leo Frobenius in the Sudan, outside of the town of Kordofan, in a little village called El Ubaid, by the chief of his camel boys, a man named Arak ben Hasul, who, after listening to various stories recounted over a period of 7 days, then stood up and said, "I have a story to tell. It's called The Legend of the Destruction of Cash." And this refers to a time way back in the Sudan when it was green, before it was a desert, and a certain tradition was being practiced. And he said that the ruling king here was known as the Nap of Napata, or the king of Napata. And Napata was the province that was the richest at this time. It had lots of gold and copper mines, and it was the richest at this time. And they had a tradition where, after a certain number of years, probably 7 years, the storyteller doesn't mention this, but we can infer it from other details that we'll see later, the king was put to death after a predetermined cycle of time, 7 years. That's a quarter of a Saturn cycle, by the way. Saturn transits every 7 years. It probably comes out of that, although in India it's every 12 years. This individual is put to death. And all the fires in the land are put out. Bulls are sacrificed. Women are locked indoors. And these are the things that take place. And then a new fire, a new Vestal fire has to be kindled. And that fire has to be kept for the next 7 years. It has to be kept going by a young boy and a young girl, both of whom are virgins. But they are appointed by the new king who comes along, and it is the king who had been sacrificed, his sister's son, which is important matrilineal descent here, and his name is Acouf, A-K-A-F. And the first thing he does is, when the king ascends the throne, he is to appoint all the individuals who, at the end of his reign, will be sacrificed along with him. And the first individual that he appoints is a storyteller who has been sent by a king from the east, a very skilled storyteller named Farley Maz, who is appointed as his official storyteller. And then his sister, Sali, S-A-L-I, is appointed to be the Vestal, keeper of the Vestal flame, she and another boy who's not mentioned in this story. And Farley Maz is fine. He knows that it's a death sentence, the storyteller. The fact that he's appointed as the official storyteller, he accepts. He says it's God's will. It is the will of Allah. So he knows that he will be executed along with the king when the time comes. But Sali, his sister, is not at all happy about this. And neither really is the king, Acouf. He's pretty depressed about it. So one night he summons Farley Maz and he says, "You know what, I'm really depressed. Tell me a story. Cheer me up." So Farley Maz proceeds to do this. The story that he tells isn't recounted, but it blows the king away. It transports him to another world. It's like the verbal equivalent, the narrative says, of hashish. He's just transported into a dreamlike dimension and eventually falls asleep, and it's absolutely amazing. So he listens to Farley Maz night after night, just transporting him, and pretty soon he realizes that he's forgotten about the anxiety of being executed at the end of his reign. Word begins to spread throughout the village as Farley Maz now has a retinue. He's walking around with slaves behind him and train. And word begins to spread, and Sali hears about it. And she says, "I'd like to hear this individual's stories I haven't heard yet. Can I hear next night?" Her brother says, "Absolutely." So the next night, Farley Maz is there, and he lays eyes on Sali, and they immediately lock eyes. And there's the love motif. They immediately have the hots for each other. And for a second, the king goes, "And go ahead. Have you lost the power of storytelling? What are you waiting for?" So Farley Maz proceeds to tell the story, puts everyone in the court to sleep before the sun rises, except for Sali, who is awake, and the two proclaim love for each other. And she says, "Well, we don't want to die. How can we find a way out of this?" he says. And she says, "Leave it up to me. I'll figure it out." So she goes to the high priest. And she says the next morning to the high priest, "Who is it that determines what will happen to the king? And the high priest says, well, that's God's will. And she says, yes, but who determines on earth God's will and keeps track of what happens? And she says, well, we do, the priests. And she says, how do you do that? And he says, well, we determine it by keeping careful track of the moon and its relation to the stars. And we watch it every night. And that tells us when it's time for the king to die. And she says, well, yes, but what would happen if a number of nights went by and you couldn't see the stars? And he said, well, we'd be in trouble then at that point because we wouldn't know exactly what the appointed time would be to execute him. So there would be a problem. And she says, well, it was revealed to me last night that life on earth is greater than God's writing in heaven. He says, what do you mean? Clarify that. And she says, well, I listened to the storytelling of Farley Maz last night, and it made me realize that his words are greater than the writing that's in the stars. And he says, well, that's blasphemy. You can't say that. And she says, I certainly can. Have you heard Farley Maz? Any of his stories? And the high priest says, well, no, I haven't actually heard him. She says, well, you should come by, listen to his tales, and then tell me what you think. He agrees. So the next night, the priests all show up along with the king. Nobody can see the king, by the way. He's in a thing where he's veiled. It's not allowed for anyone to gaze upon his visage. So all the priests show up. They listen to Farley Maz. By the time dawn comes, they're all asleep. They've just been regaled to sleep. And Sally and Farley Maz are the only ones left awake. They once again proclaim their love for each other. And then the high priest says, well, she goes back to him and says, well, what'd you think? And he goes, well, I need to hear him again. So we'll listen another night. A few nights go by. And then after a while, they start realizing they've lost track of the stars over these nights. They don't know where they're at. They start getting a little worried about this. People in the town start realizing it. And a businessman comes up to them and says, well, I'm about to leave on a voyage. These guys are astrologers, basically. I'm about to leave on a voyage. Can you tell me what the stars will be like so I'm back in time for the next festival? I want to make sure I finish the voyage and get back in time for that. And the high priest says, well, get back to us tomorrow night, and we'll get back to you. Don't worry about it. And so he confers with the other priests, and they all say, well, Farley Maz is overturning the revealed order of God here. We can't have this. And they say he has to die. And the high priest says, you're right, he does. So he goes to, he talks to Sally, and Sally says, she expresses her horror at this, and she says, well, you have to talk to my brother, the king. He's in charge of Farley Maz. So they talk to the king. And the king says, well, that's fine, but Farley Maz is appointed to die after I die. The myth is that, or the ritual is that I die, I'm killed first, and then he follows. So it has to be in that sequence. And so the high priest and his priesthood is like, well, he does have to die. And Sally is like, well, give him to me. She goes to her brother and says, I want him in part of the fulfillment of my destiny that I should have Farley Maz. So the king grants Farley Maz to her. And the next night, then, they have a big ceremony where they invite everyone in the town now, to hear Farley Maz, including all the priests. So the whole town is there now. And so Farley Maz goes into another night of spectacular storytelling. But during this night, because it's said that the will of God will be revealed here, all the high priests wind up, for some reason, dead. By the next morning, when everyone wakes up, everyone else is still alive, but all the priests are dead. And so, from that point on, Acouf becomes the first man who doesn't have to worry about being sacrificed, and he is the first king in this tradition to actually be allowed to die of old age, rather than to be sacrificed. And after him, Farley Maz rules, and the kingdom of Napata experiences a great reign until Farley Maz's death, and then there's chaos and disaster reigning. Other kingdoms come in, break their treaties, and conquer Napata and tear it apart. So that's the story told to Leo Frobenius by this man who is in charge of his camel drivers. And Campbell then says, now, Leo Frobenius quotes in one of his books the fact that the Sicilian annalist Diodorus Siculus, who visited Egypt in about 60 BC, records in his book, The Historical Library, an anecdote to the effect that there was, in the kingdom of Sudan, there had been a tradition in the Nubian kingdom of Meroe of sacrificing kings in accordance with the word received from the priesthood, but that this came to an end with certain Ethiopian king named Ergamenes. And Ergamenes, long about 300 BC, was educated by one of the Ptolemies, by one of the Alexandrian Ptolemies. It says here Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who reigned 309 to 246 BC. So this is just after Alexander's conquests. And so he's received a classical, humanistic, Hellenistic education, Ergamenes has, and he decides that this is a barbaric, inhuman practice, this practice of human sacrifice, and he slays all the priests. He puts them all to death and puts an end to the practice. And so Frobenius says that the myth recounted by this camel driver is probably an echo of some such tradition that took place within Africa that put an end to this tradition. Now, Campbell goes on and says, there is obviously a certain parallel here between this myth and the 1001 Nights, in which instead of Farley Mazder we have Scheherazade, and Scheherazade is the consort of the king who has the habit of having his consorts put to death the next morning, but she manages to escape from this by regaling him each night with stories, and she leaves them unconcluded each night so that he'll tune in the next night for another episode. And so this goes on for 1,000 nights, and finally she conceives a child by him. He's dazzled by her wit and allows her to live. And so there's some obvious parallels and similarities here, and he says that he quotes the Arab historian Al-Mazudi to the effect that there was a tradition, and it's well known, that the Arabian Nights, though in their present form they were mostly compiled and gathered together in Arabian Syria and Iraq and Egypt between the centuries of about 800 AD and 1400 AD, right in that period. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear, this Al-Mazudi says, that they were based on Persian prototypes, because in the Arabian tradition, the Arabs were the great philosophers, but the Persians in the Islamic tradition were the great poets and the great storytellers, and that it was pretty well known that most of these tales had come from Persia, that they had Persian prototypes. And so Campbell says, this may explain the provenance, but these stories, the story that is recounted is obviously recited in a style that's similar to something across the board that was produced in the great wonder tales that were generated in that period in the Middle Ages, 800 to 1400 AD, between Europe and the Middle East, India, Japan with Lady Murasaki, Persia with Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. This was the great period of producing wonder tales. They all came out of this matrix. But he says Frobenius made an interesting observation when he says that the likeliest source underneath both the Persian tradition as well as the Arabian Nights version of this tradition and the Sudanese tale told by the camel driver is that most of the fishermen that he dealt with and the sea-going Arabs that Frobenius dealt with said they believed that the stories came from Hadramaut, which is the old name for Yemen, and that there was a civilization in Yemen that was there from whence these stories migrated. And that's Frobenius's hypothesis for where the stories come from. However, they do seem to record a tradition that was common in Africa, especially in South Africa amongst the Shilluk of the White Nile, that Campbell quotes here from James Fraser's Golden Bough, to the effect that they did have a tradition where the king was put to death. After a period of 7 years, he was strangled and buried along with a Vestal Virgin, who was buried together with him. And that he says the oldest and most vivid version of this comes from Duarte Barbarossa's description of the coasts of East Africa and Malabar in the beginning of the 16th century, where Duarte Barbarossa describes a tradition in Malabar, which is the southwest coast of India, where a king would, after 12 years, one complete cycle of the planet Jupiter around the sun, would ascend a scaffold and take a knife and slice off his nose and his ears, various parts of his body, and eventually would cut his own throat. So the tradition is very well attested in this whole area. And then he comes to this point that the basic myth then is that, as Frobenius says, in South Africa, the king that was killed normally would personify the moon, and sometimes even has the nickname of Moon, and the Vestal Virgin that he was killed with was usually an incarnation of the planet Venus. And then he thinks this myth originated somewhere in the Middle East, between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, originated in that Middle Eastern zone and was diffused southeastward to India and Indonesia and southwestward across equatorial and southern Africa, all the way to the west. So that's one of the examples of what Frobenius called his Kulturkreis, his culture area circles, where we find the diffusion of ritual regicide predetermined by a priesthood with mathematically determinable cycles diffused within that zone. And so that's the basic myth here. But Campbell says underneath this myth, he thinks there's an older myth, that this myth probably originated amongst the hieratic city-states of possibly Mesopotamia. It was in 1926 that Sir Leonard Woolley unearthed the royal tombs of Ur, where it was very clear that the king and his entire court had been ritually slain, sacrificed, drank poison, the whole court. Sometimes as many as 72 virgins would be buried, playing harps, drinking poison. Seems to have come out of that zone. And then he says, well, all of this is mathematically determined, which presupposes a higher development of civilization, and the fact of kingship and the various courtiers suggest that this version of it comes out of the hieratic city-state and is a later version of what earlier must have been something that came out of the Neolithic that we went over last time, something like, for example, out of the village site of Chaionu from 8000 BC and the pre-pottery Neolithic B, where villagers would have had a much more simple version of this. He says if we analyze the various practices of putting out the Vestal fire amongst these various African tribes in the south, what we find is that the tradition is that when the fire is put out, a pubescent boy and girl, who are both virgins, each has fire sticks. The boy has a male fire stick. The female has the base that the stick is meant to rotate in. They have sex for the first time, and as they're having sex, both of them are rolled over into a pit and buried alive. He says that's the older version of the myth. It had nothing to do with astronomy or mathematics or kingship or anything like that. It came out of this older myth that he says we'll investigate soon. It's going to have to do with the idea of human sacrifice coming out of the idea of the death and resurrected dying plant god. The sacred plant of the society is normally personified by a human individual or a male and female human individual who are sacrificed at the time of their first sex act. So that's the myth. And a couple of things I would add here in commentary is that, one, I don't think the archaeology was out yet for the fact that I think the oldest version of the myth, of the hieratic version of the myth, seems to come from First Dynasty Egypt. There we find in the First Dynasty Egypt, about 3000 BC, the ritual regicide of King Acouf, who may have been the son of Narmer. We're not sure exactly. The chronology is problematic. But he was sacrificed along with his entire retinue, his entire court. He had two tombs, one in the north at Saqqara, and a tomb that was in a kind of Mesopotamian style that had 27 chambers in it, and one in the south at Abydos, where he was buried. There were 3 large tombs, 2 small ones, and 33 others for all of his retainers, which is interesting because a detail that I left out of the story that Frobenius recounted is that after the king is liberated from this cosmic cycle, they dig 3 large rectangular pits, and they plant seeds in them, and 2 smaller pits, and they plant seeds in those, and up from those sprout new wheat crops. It's interesting that the tomb of King Acouf at Abydos has these 3 large pits, and archaeologists think that he was buried in the middle one of the 3 large ones and 2 smaller ones, and then 33 smaller ones for the rest of the court. The hypothesis is that he was strangled, and his children and the rest of his court were probably all drank poison or were also strangled all at the same time, probably in accordance with the cosmic cycle. And that it came out of that, it migrated from there to Mesopotamia, which is the first dynasty of Ur, 2600 BC, as excavated by Leonard Woolley, must have been a later echo of what first took place in Egypt and migrated therefrom. The other point I want to draw your attention to about this myth, Campbell doesn't talk about this, is that it does record what happens to a society when its ruling archi are dismantled or deconstructed. There's a word here for deconstructionists of all stripes, which is to say that the metaphysical archetypes of a society are protected and they are sacred precisely because they are the ruling archi that pattern out the events of what actually takes place on the physical plane, the physical, temporal, social, and cultural plane, and they control that plane. They are essentially the immune system of the society, and when they're tampered with, or if they're destroyed, as in the case of this myth that Frobenius recounts, which obviously is a recounting of Hellenistic, Greek, humanistic influences on a much older tradition that has a disintegrative effect on the ruling archai of that tradition, and then subsequently Napata is then captured by its enemies, torn apart and cut up. There may be a word there about what happens to a society that is overzealous about dismantling its ruling metaphysical archai. The same thing can be said to have happened, I think, with classical civilization when Theodosius the Great came along in 390 AD and shut down all the pagan archive, made everything illegal. The Vestal Virgins, the Olympic Games, the writing in hieroglyphics, the entire immune system of classical civilization was shut down by him, all of its ruling archai, and then within a couple of decades, by 411 AD, Alaric and the Visigoths are at the gates of Rome, and they overtake it. The immune system, the ruling archai, are deconstructed, shut down. That ruins a society's immune system, and in come the invaders. Probably something similar also happened with the Native Americans and the Spaniards destroying their ruling archai. So that's the chapter that we'll end there with chapter 4, and next we'll move on to chapter 5, the ritual love death.